Hello, I'm Larry Levitt from KFF. Welcome to the latest episode of the new KFF series, The Health Wonk Shop. Roughly once a month, we dive into timely and complex health policy topics with experts from a variety of perspectives. Our polling has found that the top healthcare priorities for the public revolve around making prescription drugs more affordable, both capping out-of-pocket costs and lowering prices. Democrats in Congress have been discussing a plan to allow the government to negotiate drug prices in Medicare and cap price increases and inflation. That plan may pass this summer, but the fact that negotiations have been stalled in the Senate raises the question, what could the Biden administration do through executive action without Congress to make drugs more affordable? We're joined today by an impressive group of experts to discuss all this. Rachel Sachs is a law professor at Washington University in St. Louis and an expert on drug pricing. Richard Frank is a health economist and director of the USC Brookings Schaefer Initiative for Health Policy. And Kirsten Axelson is a visiting scholar at AEI and secretary of the Preparedness and Treatment Equity Coalition. She previously was a senior leader at Pfizer. If you have questions at any time, submit them through the Q&A button and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Also note that this session is being recorded and an archived version should be available later today. Rachel, let me start with you. Give us a quick elevator pitch on what authority you think the federal government has to address drug prices. What tools are there in Medicare or around drug patents to constrain prices?
Absolutely. So one point to remember is that, as our attendees will know, we have a very fragmented insurance system, and the administration's authority will be at its height as it relates to federal programs. So you might think about something like CMMI, right, which exists for the purpose of testing innovative payment models to reduce program expenditures while maintaining the quality of care. The Trump administration tried to promote an international reference pricing program for Medicare Part B using CMMI authority, and that had some procedural challenges the administration could have avoided if it wanted to, but it would have been an important substantive change. In Medicaid, you could think about the use of Section 1115 waivers. So Oregon is currently asking for permission to exclude from its Medicaid formulary drugs that have not demonstrated evidence of clinical benefit. So you can think about something like Aduhelm, which Medicare has the tools to restrict coverage of, but at present, Medicaid does not. But you were suggesting that more broadly, the administration does have tools such as the use of margin rights under the Bayh-Dole Act or the use of Section 1498 compulsory licensing. And these could be used to redound more broadly to the benefit of patients who might not be beneficiaries of federal insurance programs.
Well, a lot to unpack there, and we'll come back to all those issues. Richard, let me turn to you. So thinking about the economics of the prescription drug market, what do you see as the circumstances, if any, under which it's appropriate for the government to step in using some of these tools that Rachel talked about and regulate or constrain prices? What's an example of where you think that could work through executive action? Oh, Richard, I think you're on.
Yes. One of the principal challenges is sort of balancing incentives to innovate with sort of affordability. And that is at the heart of many of these debates. And so the places where I think there's a reasonable economic case for jumping in to regulate prices is in cases where there have been monopoly arrangements that started with patents that extend way beyond what the initial patents were for and are the result of a variety of practices used to prolong exclusivity in those drugs. Humira might be an example of that, where 21 years after it came on market, it still does not face any kind of biosimilar generic competition. And in those cases, it seems that bringing competition to the market, as was intended by both the patent system and more recent regulations, would be consistent with the idea of the government jumping in and attempting to attenuate those prices.
And Richard, how do you think about insulin in this context? There's a move on the Hill to cap out-of-pocket costs for insulin at $35 per month. Also as part of the Build Back Better Act that passed the House, but is now stalled in the Senate, government authority drug prices for insulin, at least in Medicare. Insulin's been around for a long time. So how do you think about that?
Yeah, insulin's a little bit different than what I was talking about, because in fact, the prices that insurers often pay for insulin are quite reasonable, or quite low. It's that there's this very large gap between the so-called list price and the net price. And it is that really creates an enormous difficulty for consumers. And so the thrust of most of the policies we're talking about is really aimed at lowering the price to the consumer, as opposed to lowering that sort of net price that insurers pay.
Yeah, and this gets to the rebates that drug manufacturers pay to insurers, which we'll certainly come back to. Kristen, let me switch gears a little bit. The pandemic has provided a window into some of these issues. The government has played a major role in negotiating prices and, in fact, guaranteeing a market for COVID vaccines and therapies. But critics of government price negotiation, as Richard alluded to, say it could hurt future innovation. What do you see as the lessons? What do you take as the lessons from the pandemic here?
Well, thank you. And thanks all for having me on the panel. In addition to being a visiting scholar and secretary for the Preparedness and Treatment Equity Coalition, I'm also a consultant to biopharma companies. So there you have both my experiences and my biases, just to put that out there. So as far as lessons from the pandemic, I mean, you saw when there was a market, saw companies coming in and putting huge amounts of capital they had earned from, companies such as Pfizer had earned from previous successful innovations, and putting it towards restoring the world's health and the economy. It hasn't been perfect. There's still far too many countries that don't have access to the vaccine. But following a period where there had been very limited investment and innovation in antivirals, antimicrobials, we saw that when there was a market, there was a lot of investment. And those companies that put the money on the line could have lost it all. Some of the companies took government money, some didn't. And there was, success in cases where there was government money taken and where there wasn't government money taken. So to me, the lesson is when there is a need, private companies are able to deploy capital in a way that is effective and efficient and solve major health crises.
Larry, can I jump in on that one?
Yeah, please.
I think an additional lesson is that when government gets involved, and the government was involved in every aspect of it, because in fact they guaranteed purchases for even those that didn't take money up front. But I think the lesson is that when government gets involved in an important issue in partnership with the industry, that everybody can win. And I think that is a very important lesson that many people weren't convinced of prior to the pandemic. And I think it's something to build on.
And just to emphasize some of Richard's comments, I think this Operation Warp Speed was really an incredible success story for the ability of government policymakers to positively influence innovation, right? So here, we had the ability of a small company like Moderna, which had never brought a product to market before, to work intensively with government regulators, government policymakers, and to bring a product to market essentially on the same speed as a large legacy player, Pfizer, who did not take the money up front, but did sign those advanced purchase commitments with the government. So this is really an interesting case where sustained significant efforts by the government to choose targets upfront of where to invest was really a key element of success here.
So, Kristen, let me ask you, we could probably spend the entire rest of the hour talking about vaccine pricing, but I do want to talk about it a little bit. I mean, there is a fight on the Hill now to provide additional pandemic funding, which would in part fund government purchases of vaccines. The administration has said if that doesn't pass, then they may move more quickly to kind of privatizing the vaccine market. How do you expect that? How do you see that playing out if that's what ultimately happens?
I mean, widespread vaccination with no cost sharing is so far the only proven way to get out of this, right? So sustained funding for it is the way to continue to achieve the supply that's needed. Now we need to do a whole bunch of things around trust and so that people will actually use the supply. As far as the point about the advanced purchase agreements, I think that's an excellent case, right? Like if the companies had invested in developing those vaccines and weren't successful, they still would have lost all that money and no advanced purchase agreement would have helped them. But when you put in a financial incentive out there, companies tend to do what you want them to do. They tend to go after that, which is the opposite of doing things like, say, you're going to go ahead and develop this drug and then, we may cut short your price or we may cut short your patent and you're not going to know about it at the time you invest. So what the government essentially did with the COVID vaccines was take a lot of it. It's still highly risky, but it took a lot of the risk out of the development process. And that's, I think, what continued. Obviously, the drugs are already developed, but the sustained funding will be able to continue to get the benefit of those vaccines to people at low cost, along with all the other supportive services you need in addition to vaccines.
Let's return to some of the issues Rachel started out with. And Rachel, you mentioned the Trump administration had a international reference pricing proposal for Part B drugs. Those are physician administered drugs. There was also a Trump administration proposal for eliminating rebates behind the scenes, requiring them to be provided at point of sale. That actually, at least by most estimates, would have increased Medicare spending. Talk a little bit about what the authority was as you see it for those initiatives. And you mentioned sort of procedural issues that could have potentially been avoided. I mean, are those things that you think an administration can do if they did it in the right way procedurally?
Yes, absolutely. So I don't know that our attendees want to hear an extended discussion about the Administrative Procedure Act from me at this time.
I think that's a fair assumption. Yeah.
Probably not. But I think what I would say is that it was very surprising to many observers to see the administration introduce the international reference pricing proposal as a final rule without going through, or an interim final rule without going through the normal notice and comment rulemaking procedure. And that rule was quickly enjoined by multiple federal courts on procedural grounds. They did not address the substance thereof. The rebate rule, which you mentioned, was promulgated under different authority. I believe it was formally a revision to the anti-kickback statute safe harbors from the Office of Inspector General. So there was different legal authority that was used there. There were some procedural issues that were involved there regarding whether the administration had actually withdrawn the rule. Some may remember that there were public statements that the administration was withdrawing the rule, and then they proposed to finalize it. That would have been a legal issue. It may still be in the future, but neither of those is in force at this present time. And so procedural issues like those can be somewhat avoided if the administration chooses to do so. There are other substantive issues that, of course, could arise. There were other legal challenges that the pharmaceutical industry had raised to the international reference pricing proposal, for instance. But those are different issues that could be dealt with aside from the procedural challenges. And so there's every reason to think that an administration that was motivated to focus on exactly how these were being implemented could avoid many of those pitfalls.
And let's sort of talk about this, international reference pricing or most favored nation. I mean, Richard, how would you say, assuming you could get through the legal hurdles, how would you see that playing out? Sort of pegging the prices of U.S. drugs, or at least in this case, physician-administered drugs, to the prices in other countries. Would we get lower prices? Would other countries get higher prices?
The answer is yes, and both would probably happen. The U.S. pays somewhere between 2 and 3 times what is typical in the EU for most brand name drugs, and so there's quite a bit of room to go down. Because in a sense, international research and development is sort of a public good, a social good, there's an incentive for other countries to quote free ride on the U.S. And so what you might expect to happen is that U.S. prices would come down some, and the EU, maybe Japan and Australia would go up some, depending on exactly which countries were involved in sort of the bundle that we use to compare prices on.
And Kirsten, I mean, if you were making a case, why should the U.S. pay higher prices than other countries?
Well, typically, so yes, absolutely. I'm not going to dispute the U.S. pays higher prices than other countries, although it also depends on the payer, right? If you compare the prices in the U.S., net of rebates in Medicaid and the VA, they're often similar or lower than the prices in other countries because special discounts are made to people who have either lower income or have extenuating circumstances. I mean, the U.S., you don't get longer life for nothing. And the U.S. gets faster access to new medicines. And some of those medicines are fantastic and have massively increased the 5-year survival rates for the leading cancers. And some of those medicines probably aren't worth it. But the U.S. gets faster access. And not that the U.S. has necessarily done all the things it needs to do in terms of preventive care and diagnosis and treatment and making sure that everybody in the population is benefiting. But on net, there's a trade-off. You have faster access to medicine, broader access to medicine, and you pay higher prices. If the U.S. wants to have the same prices as you see in other countries, the U.S. will not have the same access to medicine as you see in other countries. It'll be different. And other countries, if they say, in smaller countries says, I'm not going to pay for that drug, it has an effect on research and development investment, but it wouldn't be the same as if you had the U.S., which is 40% of the global market, saying, I'm no longer accepting that price. It would have an effect on what is developed. And that would be the trade-off we pay for lower prices.
So we have go ahead, please, Rich.
Well, I just wanted to note that, of course, the HHS secretary at the time that the international reference pricing proposal was moving forward was Secretary Alex Azar, who himself had been a pharmaceutical company executive. And it was very interesting to see him give speeches in which he was talking about the potential innovation impact of a change like the international reference pricing proposal. And he would say things like, look, I know these tired talking points. This is a relatively small change in the overall global financial pharma system. And it's just not the case that innovation is going to grind to a halt, he used the phrase, if we were to move this forward.
So we have a number of audience questions about this question of research and development, and particularly the role of the federal government in funding this research and how that relates to drug prices. And Richard, maybe if you could talk a little bit about what role the federal government does play in funding research, at what stage. And then I'm going to turn to Rachel to talk a little bit about margin rights and how that would work.
Well, the federal government has a very important role in funding basic research. The NIH, has a budget, a very large budget, although relatively small compared to the overall pharmaceutical industry, but nevertheless, it's in the neighborhood of getting close to $40 billion. And they fund a lot of basic research. And those are the building blocks that you see a lot of the drug development used to bring drugs to market. Now, the NIH also and the DoD also fund clinical trials in a very targeted manner, but most of the clinical trials are actually paid for by industry. And so I would say that the government's role in the development side is modest, But in terms of establishing the platforms for actually getting the products to market, they have a very central role.
So Rachel, describe in less than an hour kind of the Bayh-Dole Act, what that did around drugs where the government did research, holds a patent, and then how margin rights would work in addressing drug prices.
Right. So the Bayh-Dole Act really exists because of these concerns around the inability to commercialize, not inability, but the relatively low rates of commercialization of research that had been funded by the government. And so the idea is to allow universities, small businesses to patent the results of that research, and in the hopes that it will spur technology transfer and development. But the Bayh-Dole Act includes this provision for margin rights, where the products are not made available on reasonable terms. The government, and that was passed in the early 1980s, the government has not used the margin rights since the Bayh-Dole Act was passed. But I don't want us to think that it is the only compulsory licensing provision in federal law. So one much older provision is Section 1498, which is very commonly used. It's used very frequently. And essentially, because I see there are comments about, well, what is this compulsory licensing thing, right? The idea is if you have a patent normally that allows you to stop others from making and selling the patented invention. The idea here with both Bayh-Dole margin rights and Section 1498 is that the government can allow someone else to make and sell that patented product without the permission of the patent holder. It's not uncompensated, right? It includes reasonable compensation or reasonable royalties, depending on sort of however it's framed, to the patent holder. But it does mean that you're taking away their exclusive right to permit others to make and sell the drug. Here it would be a drug. In other cases, it would be something else. So Section 1498 is frequently used in the defense context, for instance, for all kinds of non-drug interventions. And it can be much more successful because it's not tied specifically to government funding. So one issue that has sometimes come up is if there is a product which is not necessarily a classic Bayh-Dole product, can there be a compulsory licensing intervention? The answer is yes, if you use Section 1498. I do want to have one caveat here, and then I'll be done, I promise, which is that these laws speak in terms of patents. They don't speak in terms of other rights, such as exclusivity periods or trade secrecy. So people may know that if you get a new drug approved, the FDA will grant you 5, 7, or 12, depending on the type of drug it is, years of exclusivity for that product to be on the market. The compulsory licensing provisions of Bayh-Dole or 1498 don't touch that. So at a minimum, we're talking about after a company has had 5, 7, or 12 years of exclusivity, only then can these compulsory licensing provisions really be effective.
And Rachel, what are using 1498 authority for compulsory licensing? What are the circumstances in statute in which that could happen?
So I happen to have the statute up here, right? So there are a few limitations in the statute. So it talks about use or manufacture by or for the United States. So there might be some litigation over the meaning of those terms in terms of whether the use of a product would be applicable under the statute, but it's quite broad. It's really broad, right? It talks about inventions described in and covered by a patent of the United States. And then it sort of specifies what the patent holder's remedies are in terms of obtaining compensation when a compulsory license is issued. So it's far broader. It's a much older statute intended at sort of allowing the government to engage in compulsory licensing quite broadly. It predates, right, a lot of the existing FDA regulatory apparatus.
And Kristen, let me bring you in. What would you see as some of the circumstances under which compulsory licensing might be appropriate, but also kind of from your perspective, what some of the pitfalls might be?
Sure. And I would be great. I want to just quickly follow on from the comment that Secretary Azar made about innovation won't come grinding to a halt. It will not come grinding to a halt, but there are a number of published studies out there that show there is a relationship between market size and investment. And also, we just have to look at things like the Orphan Drug Act, which some have said should be limited, but it did spur a lot of investment in drugs for rare diseases. So I don't think we can have it both ways. Like, market size does have an effect on what gets made. And to the point, and I'll tie that into compulsory licensing, you add more uncertainty into the process of investing in a drug, you're going to see companies not investing in drugs that might be compulsory licensed. And typically you think of a compulsory license in a situation where the drug is for a very high need, very serious disease in a population that might not be getting access, probably because of affordability. And those would be the drugs that would be sort of most at risk to be compulsory licensed. Companies have invested in a lot of those drugs, whether it be for HIV or other infectious diseases, with an expectation that there is going to be some parts of the market that'll pay and some parts of the market that won't pay. There's a big Medicaid population, for example, there where the prices are set essentially by the federal government. So my view is if you were to increase the use of things like compulsory licenses or implement use margin rates more frequently, you would find companies not being as interested in developing those drugs that might fall under the domain of those practices.
Thanks. So let me switch gears a little bit. We've had several questions about not just the prices, the underlying prices for drugs, but what consumers actually pay. And the vast majority of people are insured either in private insurance plans, particularly through an employer, Medicare, certainly, and Medicaid. So what they pay out of pocket is determined largely by the structure of their plans. And, this has been something of a political fight between the drug industry and the insurance industry. Who's to blame here? Richard, first talk a little bit about the economics here. I mean, what do underlying prices matter to consumers? How much of the problem in out-of-pocket costs is prices versus the structure of benefit plans?
So let me just start by just summarizing quickly how the rebates work, actually, because that matters. So what typically happens is a price is set, a list price, shall we say, and then there is a negotiation based on that price between the insurance industry and its representatives, the pharmaceutical benefit manufacturers, and the manufacturers. And the way it works is these are not just price negotiations, these are performance contracts. So what happens is a company will say, I will rebate you a bunch of money if you buy a certain amount of this drug. And so when it's determined that that amount of the product has been bought, then the manufacturer sends back to the insurer some money. That hasn't done anything to change the list price. And so when you have co-insurance and deductibles, the consumer is still being held responsible for paying their portion of that list price. And so that has a couple of effects. One, because the negotiations are done off list price, the bigger the list price, the bigger the rebate. And so that creates an incentive for everyone to have high list prices. The second thing it does is it essentially reduces the amount of insurance coverage a consumer has. And then, at the end of the day, the consumer is the only person in this contractual set of arrangements that's left out. And so therein lies the problem. And the consumer, therefore, pays the full price, even though all the other participants in the market are dealing with a different lower set of prices.
So I mean, as Rachel talked about earlier, the Trump administration, moved, at least in some circumstances, to ban these rebates or limit them. What effect would that have in your view if that was done throughout the market, let's say?
So I think the important thing is to understand that private negotiations can be our friend. That is that when there are private negotiations, it will drive prices down. And so that was the problem with the Trump proposal, was that it brought them all out into the daylight, which meant that people are going to be more reluctant to give discounts and rebates. And so that's what was undergirding the price rise that you're talking about, the extra spending. One way to get around this is to kind of get rid of deductibles and co-insurance and just use co-payments. And then the consumer will know what they're supposed to get paid, and there'll be no incentive to raise the list price. So, that's a simple-minded example, but it's one that sort of gets at what I thought you were pointing to as the heart of the problem.
Yeah, I mean, and in fact, at least in employer-based insurance plans, the market's been moving in exactly the opposite direction, using greater use of deductibles and co-insurance rather than co-pays, which leaves consumers exposed to those list prices. Rachel, so we talked. You talked a lot about the authority the administration might have to address prices. The other part of this congressional debate is, at least in Medicare, the structure of the benefit. Adding a cap on out-of-pocket costs to Medicare Part D, which does not exist now. Are there any mechanisms, administrative mechanisms, to address the structure of the benefit and to protect patients from out-of-pocket costs that way?
So I absolutely think that there are creative solutions the administration could use if they wanted to try to address the out-of-pocket burdens that Medicare beneficiaries are dealing with. And I'll just give one shout out here briefly to Stacey Ducensina's recent paper in Health Affairs, which I hope many people have seen, in which she and her colleagues report that among Medicare Part D beneficiaries without subsidies, 30% of patients did not fill their initial prescriptions for cancer medicine because of these really high out-of-pocket costs. So we know that this is a significant problem for Medicare beneficiaries. And one other thing I'll note is that the potential solutions to this really do go beyond Medicare. So we were just talking about this idea of high deductible plans, but we also know that these high deductible plans do have the ability to include first dollar coverage of many important prescription drugs. And there was a recent study, I apologize, I'm not remembering the authors, showing that most of these plans had incorporated first dollar coverage for really essential medications like insulin, but that there was still a long way to go on other products. So there is much more that can be done under existing law, even in private plans.
We also had a question, we've talked a lot about the federal government. We also had a question about states and what states might be able to do here. Obviously, Medicaid programs are a big part of states' role in healthcare. Medicaid prices after the rebates, which we talked about, which are statutory in Medicaid, are actually the lowest of any of these payers. But some states have moved to put in place some transparency measures around drug pricing, bulk purchasing. California is looking to actually manufacture generic drugs. Rachel, talk a little bit about what you think states themselves could do here.
Yeah, absolutely. And so first, I do want to disclose that I've done some work on this topic for NASHP, the National Academy for State Health Policy, in thinking through some of the legal issues involved in state efforts to combat high drug prices. But one interesting thing we've seen with a number of states more recently is they've been passing and implementing PDABs, prescription drug affordability boards or affordability review boards, where the idea is to take a close look really at the prices for some of these products, which are having significant cost impacts either on the state or beneficiaries, and thinking about, can we conduct an affordability review? Can we set an upper payment limit? And what are some of the legal authorities that we as a state have to do that? And how can we learn from previous efforts by states or DC? There's a notable case out of DC to try to combat high drug prices, where the court said that the specific way that it was done in those cases was not permissible. So I know that the pharmaceutical industry is likely to bring lawsuits regarding most, if not all, of these state efforts, but states are trying because they feel like they can't wait, right, for federal government action. And even federal government action is more likely to focus on Medicare, Medicaid than it is to focus on private insurance.
Kirsten, let's talk about this question of transparency. And Richard brought it up earlier about private negotiations can be your friend. It feels to many like these pricing discussions and pricing decisions are a black box. That it's hard to figure out even what the price is, because you don't know. No one publicly knows what these rebates are. Are there, in your view, downsides to more transparency around these prices?
It really depends on the type of transparency, and is the transparency going to provide meaningful information to people about their drugs? First, I'll start off by saying the list price of the drug is information that is published every month. If the federal government wanted to call out the huge drug price increases, that information could have been published every month. We would have seen the big price increases. It's one of these things that could have been addressed very easily, and that data has been available forever. So if you want to see 1,000% price increase in a particular month, that's easily purchased and easily called out, and you don't need new legislation or boards to do that. The second thing that we could, as a country, follow through on our promise to deliver is interconnected real-world evidence. We should know how these drugs are actually working in practice. The problem with assessing the drug's value and affordability when it's launched is that is the worst information you will ever have about that drug. When a drug is launched, it's in a very controlled population. It's typically in a whiter population, a more affluent population. You also aren't looking at all the other costs of care that person has. A person with cancer also has costs of care for other things, such as trips to the ER, depending on the side effect profile, and there's nausea. We need to be harnessing the real world evidence that many of the states had and making the drug companies accountable for the value of their medicines that are in practice. And that data should be available, interconnected between hospitals, the patients, ambulatory care, and we should be able to see whether or not that drug is worth it. So to me, that's the kind of transparency that is important. Again, as far as knowing what the rebates are, that information is private at the company level, and meaning you don't know what the rebate is between United Healthcare and drug company A, B, or C. But the average level of rebates has been disclosed for some time. Analysts have been figuring it out based on financial statements. And we know what that is. And it's sometimes 40%, it's sometimes 70%. But yet there's still pressure on the list price. So I'm not convinced that that kind of transparency has done anything either to help patients have lower out-of-pocket costs, because the issues Richard already mentioned. If you're in the deductible, you have to pay the list price. And it hasn't really taken off it hasn't really helped those drug companies who are giving the 70% discount get any less pressure from the consumer on them, because they're not feeling that benefit of their rebate.
So Chris, let me ask you, you talked about greater transparency around the value of drugs, the effectiveness of drugs after they've been on the market. Is there a role for government in that? Is there a need for government in that? More authority necessary to make that happen, or do you view that as something that private payers should be pushing on?
We still don't have interoperability standards that are federally, either the federal government or private industry, if we think private industry do it. So yes, I think there could be more investment in making that data available, especially if you consider making it available to academic institutions that might not always have access to it. We, right now have, I think, a lot of the outcomes research being done in fairly elite settings that don't necessarily include researchers that represent a lot of our populations who aren't being well served by the healthcare system. So yeah, I think standards and funding would be two things I think the federal government could do to enable more private and public research and transparency into what is in this data.
So one thing that we've been talking a lot about the role of government. We have also seen some private actors like Mark Cuban move to negotiate lower prices for drugs. Richard, let me ask you: Do you? I mean, is this a systemic solution to the problems we've been talking about?
Well, just going back to the beginning. If you see the problem as one of excessive prices for a prolonged period of time because there's no competition, and because competition has been blocked, then having somebody come in and think they can do a better job negotiating when there's no competition, I don't think is a very promising strategy. And so if in fact you see the problem as being that set of drugs, then I think you need to do something to either increase the ability to compete or to put in place administered prices. If, I don't, there's lots of parts of the market where negotiation works reasonably well because there's competition and there's generics and there's biosimilars. It's the places where, as I gave you at the beginning, the example of Humira, where for 21 years, this company has held off competition. And those prices have been continuously increasing from a very high base level. And so if that's the problem, Mark Cuban's not going to fix that.
Rachel, what do you think? Is there promise in what Mark Cuban's been doing?
So there's a blog post by Craig Garthwaite and David Dranov many years ago. The topic, or the title of which has always stayed with me, which is "All low-priced drugs are alike. All high-priced drugs are high-priced in their own way," after the Tolstoy line, and which is to say that there are many different ways to respond to different high-priced drugs and the reasons that different drugs may have different high prices. So the Mark Cuban disruption strategy may be effective for some particular products, but it is not going to be the blanket solution that Americans need for this problem.
Well, I will say we have not seen any blanket solutions yet from disruptors who want to come into the healthcare system, and it may still happen, but we have not seen it yet. Well, we're unfortunately coming to the end of the time. I want to thank all of you for a terrific discussion. We could go on for much longer, and maybe we'll come back to this topic depending on what Congress does this summer. And want to thank the audience for joining us, and a recording of this will be available later today on kff.org. Thanks again.